relationships that are context-orientated. Of course, like any other ethical theory, it has not gone uncriticized. And one of the greatest shortcomings and one of the greatest criticism leveled against virtue ethics is that it is not action guiding. So by stipulating a number of virtues which would be important in, say, for example, healthcare practice, it is not evident how these virtues would guide action. And virtue ethicists have argued that, well, by the fact that a moral character or an individual would display and exercise a particular virtue, for example, the virtue of truth-telling, that would automatically mean that that individual would not tell a lie. However, I do concede that it could be a little bit complicated and subjective as using the virtues as the sole guidance in the ethical decision-making process. And I do believe that it is better suited as complementary to other existing ethical theories. So the following virtues have been designated as being important in the practice of healthcare. This is by Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, who was a virtue ethicist. Fidelity to trust, which is intrinsic to the healing profession. Benevolence, because we always want to ensure the good of the patient. Effacement of self-interest due to the vulnerability and the dependency of our patients. Compassion and caring, which is the bedrock of healthcare practice. And intellectual honesty, since venturing outside one's field of expertise could be harmful to the patient. And of course, justice in the fair distribution of resources. What is interesting about justice is that it is both a principle as well as a virtue. And virtue ethicists believe that through the exercise of these virtues, the very nature of medical practice is respected and the vulnerability of the patient is protected. And virtues allow us to achieve the goods internal to the practice, but also enable us to overcome some of the harms, the dangers, the temptations, the distractions which we may encounter, and will furnish us with increasing self-knowledge and increased knowledge of the good. So at this point, I thought that we would apply virtue ethics and the virtues to one of the ethical dilemmas which has arisen out of the current COVID-19 pandemic, namely restrictions on individual freedom. In the form of isolation and quarantine. This denotes the power of the state to deprive the individual of free movement. It is not something new. It actually dates back to the 14th century, where quarantine had been used as an important strategy in the containment of contagious diseases. And then the question arises, should we collaborate or cooperate with restrictions such as wearing masks in public and social distancing? And we will answer this question by applying the virtues and virtue ethics. But before we do that, I would like to contrast the answer to this question and also the virtues against a different type of ethical approach, which is known as the utilitarian approach. So a utilitarian approach considers that actions are morally right based on their consequences, and the consequences and the rightness of the action is determined by the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. So a utilitarian debate in answering the question would go something like this. Well, the anticipated death toll is not too high, or at least not higher than that of the seasonal flu. Allegedly or predominantly, only the weak and the old people will require hospitalization. And the impact that, say, for example, a lockdown will have on the economy will damage many more people than the ones physically affected by the disease. So from a utilitarian perspective, the question would be answered negatively, and it would seem that young and strong people should not worry and should continue with the activities as normal, as it is the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. Now, if we contrast this to the application of the virtues of, say, for example, generosity, prudence, courage, compassion, which are relevant to the current situation, we note that the virtue of generosity, which entails giving and sharing of one's possession, is very, very applicable in our current COVID-19 context, and we have seen many, many acts of generosity, which entails assisting people, which will leave less for oneself. So there is a definite sacrificial dimension to this virtue. But during times of pandemics, we have to show generosity to those that are vulnerable in this scenario. Solidarity is the virtue that allows us to understand and appreciate the inherent dignity of each individual person, and the fact that we are all interdependent on each other and on other people, and the fact that we are actually all in this together. And acts of solidarity would entail or would compel us to respect regulations such as wearing masks and social distancing in order to protect those less vulnerable and the weaker. Then the virtue of prudence is an interesting one, because it denotes that one needs to have the ability to correctly deliberate about what is beneficial both for oneself and for one's community. And prudence also allows different response to different types of imposed restrictions. So as we are slowly but surely easing out of the lockdown, and as restrictions are decreasing, we should all be prudent, and we should not forget about those that are still vulnerable in this time. So the virtue of prudence would also answer this question positively. And finally, the virtue of courage, which is a very interesting virtue, illustrates that our emotions actually play a very important part in our actions and should be incorporated in our ethical decision-making process. So in this context, the virtue of courage compels us to express the appropriate feelings towards frightening things such as contracting COVID-19, infecting others, possibly losing income, possibly domestic stress if one needs to stay at home. And this virtue illustrates how if we have excessive courage, or if we have excessive courageous attitude, this could lead to a very reckless attitude, which could expose individuals to the COVID-19 pandemic, to the COVID-19 disease, whereas too little courage would make the person display a cowardly attitude, and that individual might, for example, be even too afraid to leave their house. So we really need to regulate our emotions as part of the response to this pandemic. So from a virtue ethics perspective, the question which we asked, which is, should we adhere to or collaborate with restrictions and such as, or recommendations such as wearing masks and social distancing? So from a virtue ethics perspective, this would certainly be answered in a positive way, and it would entail us embracing the virtue of generosity, courage, solidarity, and prudence would be considered virtuously right actions. Furthermore, our generosity, courage, solidarity, and prudence would prevent us from forgetting the most vulnerable, the old, and the weak, because a virtuous person would regard everyone. And then finally, in terms of lessons learned thus far, we have observed that solidarity measures, which are based on moral persuasion and not on threats of punishment, really have a higher likelihood of public acceptance and compliance. and how other virtues can further guide our response as we are slowly phasing out of this pandemic. Compassion, which is basically the bedrock of healthcare practice. Compassionate people and policies recognize suffering and take actions to alleviate it. And compassion means that one refuses to regard any suffering as a matter of indifference. And then justice, which is the fair distribution of resources and the social structures that enable condition of